Okay, so welcome everyone. Hope everybody's having a great time and enjoying networking the conference. In this session, we are joined by Grace Martineau from the Assembly of First Nations and Christopher Hoyas from the Chiefs of Ontario. In this presentation, Grace will be providing an update on housing, infrastructure, homelessness, and clean drinking water initiatives that advance First Nations jurisdictions over these areas, including the AFN pre-budget submissions, closing the infrastructure gap, work on urban and rural housing, and implementing the First Nations homelessness action plan. Geez, that's a mouthful. Chris from COO will also be shedding light on the evolving landscape of First Nation housing advocacy and support. So, Grace, ready to go? She seems to be.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Tanse. I'm Grace Martineau. I'm the director of the housing and infrastructure sector at the Assembly of First Nations. I'm grateful to be here today with you on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation and the Robinson Superior Treaty. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be back. It's been a couple of years, I think, since I've been at the First Nations Housing Conference. See a few familiar faces. That's great. I'm a member of Frog Lake First Nation in Treaty 6, Alberta. So today I'm going to provide just an overview of some of the initiatives and some of the, some of the key files we're working on at the Assembly of First Nations. So that we could help our leadership advance. Okay, great, thanks. Advance their priorities with respect to housing and infrastructure. All right, so I'll just provide an overview of the housing and infrastructure sector at the Assembly of First Nations. So we play an important role there with respect to our relationship with our chiefs through our Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure and our technicians. We work closely with them to advance the First Nations in Assembly mandates, our resolutions that tell us what to do, basically. So the chiefs mandate their priorities, what they would like us to focus on, and then we take those priorities and work on them, and we advocate for either funding, for example, changes in policy, and some programs. And we look for ways to find the investments First Nations need to close that infrastructure gap. And that infrastructure gap includes housing as well as many other categories. So closing the infrastructure gap is one of those mandates that the chiefs gave us through resolution 26, 2021. So in 2021, they said they want to start looking at the infrastructure needs in all First Nations across Canada. How can we close that back? And at that time, that was also a mandate of the Prime Minister Trudeau, and he gave that mandate to Indigenous Services Canada Minister Patty Hadju, who is the minister now. So the First Nations. We know that First Nations funding for infrastructure has been grossly neglected and underfunded. So we embarked on looking at the data that is needed to show government what those infrastructure needs are. We worked on a report with Indigenous Services Canada. Indigenous Services Canada and several consultants, our Chiefs Committee and our technicians on closing the infrastructure gap by 2030. And this report we have identified that there's an infrastructure need of about $350 billion, $349.2 billion to be exact, of infrastructure. So this is the number that we're using to base our advocacy on. This is the number that Indigenous Services Canada is now using. They're using the estimates within that report to advocate, or when they do their budget submissions to Treasury Board. So this report was developed in collaboration with also 400 First Nations across Canada. So those were direct asks. Other bases for the estimates were First Nations engineering reports. Our housing needs study was one of the biggest foundations to that report. And if you recall, in Ontario, FNHC leaded the housing needs survey in Ontario, and at that point was 100%. Thanks, Chris. So I'm just talking and not forwarding the slides. Okay. Yeah, so 349.2 billion. That's our estimates. Here's the breakdown of these estimates. As you can see, housing is the biggest portion of that need. Housing needs across Canada and First Nations is $135.1 billion. That's huge. We knew that there was a housing need, but these numbers are staggering. In fact, the $350 billion of infrastructure needs is also staggering. And this includes, because we know that we can't just look at housing alone. We have to look at our infrastructure. It's all connected. It's all interrelated. So we have to look at it holistically. And we know that if we don't do anything, if government doesn't invest, and if we're not innovative and creative, that gap by 2040 is expected to grow to $527 billion. That's 16 more years of inadequate infrastructure for First Nations. And we're not even talking about inflation or what the possible tariff threats could have on the impact it could have on First Nations infrastructure. We're taking a close look at that right now. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Minister Hadju has acknowledged it. Yep. Yeah, it's a accepted report now, and we believe this is an historical milestone report. It's the first report of its kind, actually led and developed by First Nations. So the Assembly of First Nations, in collaboration with Indigenous Services Canada, of course, but it wasn't a third-party engineering report that Indigenous Services Canada usually promotes. But there wasn't enough that we advocate for the 349.2 billion. We just took it one step further to show, well, what would happen if we do close that infrastructure gap in First Nations? What are the benefits? Well, we're showing that there are truly benefits to closing that infrastructure gap. We worked with the Conference Board of Canada, who took the report, excuse me, and used the estimates within the report to look at, well, what are the economic benefits of closing that infrastructure gap? They have their own proprietary modeling that they used, and we worked again with our some consultants and some technicians on the development of this report. Here's the breakdown of this report. So we've shown government now that closing the infrastructure gap will have a $309 billion GDP, for example. 338,000 jobs created. Almost 32,000 of them for First Nations. So we know it's going to have a great beneficial effect on all Canadians, not just First Nations. We know what closing the infrastructure gap is, what the benefit will be. We know it's going to improve community well-being, improve our health, and it just will meet the needs of each First Nation. So here's just a little bit of a explanation on the $308 billion in GDP, and what it means. You know, for every dollar spent, it would contribute 89 cents to Canada's gross domestic product. That's a huge impact. So as you can see, this is what's needed to convince government of the need for investing in First Nations infrastructure, which includes housing. But what happens, say we really did get that $349 billion, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to build that infrastructure? We haven't dug into the details of exactly how that's going to be done. However, we propose that some of the ways that we can meet those goals is through some of these strategies, for, of course, training and development through our apprenticeship programs, targeted immigration, for example, partnering with First Nations, tax incentives, retaining talent. We don't know, but these are just some of the areas that could be a possibility to ensure that infrastructure could be built in our First Nations. No, we came up with this number. It was the 350 billion, as I indicated, was based. The foundation of that report was based on the housing needs study. I think that was back in 2000 and I don't know what it was. Where's Clarence? When did we do that needs study? That was back in 2018, 2019, around there, Chastity? Yeah, something like that. So that was that needs study, because we know that infrastructure is usually based on housing. It's based on the number of people that live in the house. It was also based on an asset needs study that the Assembly of First Nations worked with I think First Nations Engineering or Associated Engineering. And then, of course, some other reports. And then those direct asks from Indigenous Services Canada to 400 First Nations on specific needs, what their needs are. So that's what these are based on. It's our own report. It's not FNHC or, yep, so that's a good thing. So we use these, we've been using the Closing the Infrastructure Gap report in our pre-budget submissions. So every year, the Assembly First Nations submits a budget to Treasury Board or to the Department of Finance. It's one of our ways to advocate for those investment needs. This is what we asked for, the $349.2 billion in total, but breaking it down a little bit here, you know, that $135 billion for housing, and then the $2.76 billion for the off-reserve housing that chiefs need. We started to look at the needs of, well, we haven't looked at the needs for our off-reserve members, our citizens. However, our Chiefs Committee and our chiefs they keep telling us that it's important that we look out for our citizens no matter where we live, no matter where they live. So how can First Nations leaders take advantage of any off-reserve targeted funding so that they can use that funding to, say, build housing off-reserve for their members or provide housing, some type of a housing services for their members. Because we know there's a shortage of housing on reserve. If there was enough housing on reserve, chances are most would stay. But people have to leave because there's nowhere to live. So how can we meet that need off reserve? So out of the funding that the government announced for off reserve housing, we estimate that the need, we don't know exactly, but our we'll call it a crude estimate, $2.76 billion of that should have been carved out for First Nations, and we didn't get anywhere near that. However, we did get some, and I know that Ontario is going to talk a little bit about some of that earned funding that they received, so that chiefs can at least start thinking about where they want to go with meeting the needs for their off-reserve members. What else here? Indigenous Services Canada was planning to go to cabinet with a memorandum to cabinet. What they're proposing is to do a one window approach for all their infrastructure programs across all departments. That would be a good thing, but unfortunately, we don't know where that's going to go now. They did not get a chance to submit that report because of the prorogation of government. And we also, that memorandum to cabinet also looks at the monetization of federal transfers. So how can we use those investments to make more money? Are we going to get that $349.2 billion? That would be nice, but the reality is likely not. So how could we take advantage of what we get by investing so that we can ultimately meet First Nations housing needs? Okay. So back in the spring, or last spring, the Auditor General of Canada put out their report. And in that report, they made it clear that there was a need for change and that government needed to do better with respect to First Nations housing. We're working closely with CMHC and Indigenous Services Canada on how that can be done. But That's a hard thing to do because CMHC and Indigenous Services Canada sometimes likes to do things unilaterally without engaging First Nations. But we're working with them to ensure that we're a part of whatever initiative or policy or advocacy, whatever they're doing, First Nations have to be a part of. We need to be at the table with them, either co-development or collaborating, or better yet, leading any initiative that affects First Nations. Some of the other initiatives that we're working on, all of our work is based on the First Nations National Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. And that was, it's an older document now. It needs to be developed. However, we still follow it in the implementation plan. So we're going to embark on updating it, considering the environment and the needs for our off-reserve members. We don't have much in that strategy with respect to that. So we're going to be doing that, hopefully influencing Canada's housing plan. There are Canada's National Housing Plan. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's where probably if we're going to get any monetization or financing for housing and infrastructure, it's going to be from the private sector. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to leadership, up to chiefs in the First Nations to decide how they're going to prioritize their housing and how they're going to get financing if required, or keep advocating for the full investments. So Canada's housing plan, of course, entails a number of programs and initiatives. And one of the area that's important and kind of new to us are the federal lands. We know that there's a need for lands in First Nations. We're thinking about maybe working with our Chiefs Committee and our technicians on a resolution at the next annual General Assembly in Winnipeg, a resolution on obtaining how First Nations can obtain more lands, or advocating for ways to expand their land base or something else, whatever that may be. What else are we doing? The Housing and Infrastructure Forum and Drinking Water Forum is taking place in 2 weeks, actually, in Calgary. I'll speak more on that towards the end of the presentation. What else? Homelessness. One of the other areas we focus on is homelessness, because we know that due to the lack of housing, or as one of the reasons, homelessness prevails. So how can we meet the needs of our homelessness citizens? Or we would like to close that gap and have no homelessness, but right now we still need to advocate for homelessness related programs and services. We work closely with the Joint Working Group on Housing and Homelessness. The Joint Working Group is made up of our government partners, Canada Mortgage and Housing, Indigenous Services Canada, and Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada, which is formerly Infrastructure Canada, and our regional technicians sit as a committee to help to work together to make changes and influence government policy. So it's a really good way to work closely with government and kind of, we call it like making sure that they're doing things right, and if they're not, how can we break down those barriers? What do we need to change? That's what the joint working group is. It works well that way. But many times our federal partners offer to co-develop, but don't end up being co-developed. And one example is with the EARN strategy. We had provided much input into that EARN strategy, but at the end of the day, they didn't take our input and just went in with their own memoranda to cabinet. It was very disappointing, but we are still working closely with them and looking for ways on how we can work better together. What else is here? Through the joint working group, the AFN and partners are looking at developing a multi-year housing plan. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but these are some of the objectives proposed in that. Closing the infrastructure gap, we know we already working on that, but how can we find the sources of capital? What capital do First Nations need? And of course, transfer of services under ISC's, Indigenous Services Canada Transfer of Services initiatives. They're promoting that care and control of housing and infrastructure. Through that, on that track to self-determination, we promote that as well. However, it's a hard thing to do when your infrastructure and your housing is in a deficit. It's a hard thing to do to take care and control of programs when there's such a need. And it's a hard thing to do when programs and services don't meet the needs of your First Nations citizens. So looking for ways to change that. And the transfer of care and control of services, I think that pot's run dry now. So any initiatives First Nations want to see are likely on their own. Moving forward, what else is here? I guess I should move on. Haven't even talked about homelessness. I just started a little bit. Anyways, I'll try to be a little quicker. We've developed a First Nations National Homelessness Action Plan and implementation plan. This was a mandate from our First Nations in Assembly back in 2019. So the reason why was to really delve into holistically, what does that look like? Where are all the programs and services? What do First Nations need? And where's the data? And that's probably one of the most difficult areas, because any data that's out there is usually lumped up with other data, including Métis and Inuit, so Indigenous scope. We maintain a close connection with the National Housing Advocate with respect to housing and homelessness and encampments. I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. That's one area. And one of the other areas out of our National First Nations Homelessness Action Plan is a project working closely with veterans. We're working with our Veterans Council on their specific needs. That is underway right now, and that should be completed by the end of March. What else here? Through the Reaching Home program, what is it, Infrastructure Canada, or Housing and Infrastructure Community, what is that? Housing Infrastructure Communities Canada. Their Reaching Home program. We've advocated for funding for First Nations Reaching Home. There was no program dedicated to First Nations. It was always Indigenous, but now there is funding for our regions so that they could provide at least some level of help to First Nations homelessness delivery providers. It's not much money. It's a drop in the bucket of what is really needed, but it was a place to start. And I think Chris, who is that? OFNTSC, I believe, has that contract to look out to allocate that funding within Ontario. Do you have, what's that? 2? Yeah. Just in time, this is my last slide. So this is our conference that's coming up in a couple of weeks in Calgary. You're welcome to join us there. We've decided this year to amalgamate 3 conferences, our infrastructure conference, our asset management conference, our national water symposium, and a housing conference, all under one roof. We were finding it difficult to coordinate 3 forums in 1 year, and not to mention the expenses. So more information is on our website, or if you need more information on anything that I've talked about. I've only just gave you a brief outline of what we're doing. We work closely with Chris at the Chiefs of Ontario, as well as through the Chiefs Committee and as a technician. But reach out to me or Chris, and we can try to answer. Anyways, thank you for having me. It was really nice to be here, and take care.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Just waiting for the PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. I'm going to be talking about a couple different projects that the Chiefs of Ontario is working on. We do have a lot more things on the go in housing and infrastructure, but I picked 2 that I felt were some of the bigger projects and that might be a little bit more relevant for everybody here today. So the first is the transfer of care and control of housing. And so this has been an ongoing project for quite some time now. The Chiefs of Ontario, or the Chiefs in Assembly, they passed a resolution in 2020. So what is that, almost 5 years ago now, that mandated us at the Chiefs of Ontario to start taking a look at this and do some engagement on what some potential models might look like for the transfer of care and control. I'll explain what that is, transfer of care and control. Oh, I don't have a slide on that. I must have deleted it out of my presentation. But basically, in a nutshell, what it is, Indigenous Services Canada, once they came to be, what was that, 2016 or what have you, and they split off with CERNAC. Their mandate is basically to cease to exist after a certain amount of time. They want First Nations to take on the provision of all their own programs and services. So you'll actually see in a lot of different sectors, not just housing and infrastructure, ISC trying to go through this process of transfer, right? So in healthcare, there's a health transformation. Water infrastructure is a different one. We're seeing that with the legislation. There's emergency management as well. So there's this process kind of ongoing in a lot of different sectors. So we've been kind of looking at what that might look like in Ontario, not prescribing anything here, just looking at models that might work as a resource for when First Nations are ready to kind of do this work. So some of the past work that we've been doing, we hosted quite a few workshops, I think about 4 or 5 workshops, and we hosted a summit as well. Following that, we used that to develop a what we heard report. And I'm going to go over, I think, about 3 or 4 reports in this presentation, and I can make those available to whomever. I can leave some business cards or give you my email. Yeah, so we developed a what we heard report, and then based on that, we started developing some housing models. Actually, we got some help from FNHC in developing those initial models. And then what we did is we brought those models to the chiefs and said, hey, look, we've got 5 different models. What do you guys think? And basically they said 2 are absolute crap. The other 3, we'll see. We'll give you guys a shot, see what you can do with them. So we took 3 of those models, and the next step for us was to actually then cost them out, right? It's pretty easy to build a model and say, oh, this is how this is going to work, this is how this is going to work. But really what it comes down to is, is this feasible, financially speaking? Does it make sense? And so that's kind of where we're at right now. We've done the costing. So we got IFSD, Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, to help us cost out the various models. So we have that report ready. We can actually share that with people in its draft form. It hasn't been fully approved by the chiefs yet, but we're taking it on the road, so to speak. So getting it out there, getting in front of chiefs, getting in front of technicians. This is just a little advertising session for it. If you do want to have like the real chat with us and get that information, we're more than happy to have a meeting with whomever and kind of explain it and get your feedback on how to make these models more useful. So it really, at the end of the day, like I said, it's a resource for you to use. I know there are, I think, a couple tribal councils who are looking at kind of starting their own housing organization and starting to take over the transfer. There might also be one of the large First Nations that are looking at it as well. Not naming any names because I think it's still really in the early phases. But just to say that I think there is some interest here and there from some of the communities to start taking over, and doing their own programs and services. ISK's role in a situation like this, so they've said, would really only be to transfer the funding. So 10-year plans, 5-year plans, what have you, transferring the funding. And then basically the First Nations would then be up to them or up to this organization to decide how the money is spent. Okay, so we talked about that already. Now, the reason why this project is kind of coming to a bit of an end, and why we basically told ISK, I think at this point, that once we reach this stage, that'll probably be it for the Chiefs of Ontario, specifically working on this right now. There might be at some point we might take it on again. But what we heard in a lot of our engagements is there's some pretty substantial prerequisites to transfer. And this is coming from chiefs and and technicians that we've talked to. And I mean, you heard Grace's presentation and what the gap is, right? The housing gap, the infrastructure gap. We have a separate report that you heard some national numbers there. We have a separate report for Ontario specifically. We hired the same consultants that they worked with, so they just portioned off the Ontario. They portioned off the Ontario numbers for us, so we can share that with you, so you can kind of look in more granular detail. But the Ontario backlog for housing is about 25 billion. It's an incredible amount of money, and the amount that gets spent by ISK every year actually means that the gap continues to widen. So they're not even spending enough to cut the rate at which the gap is widening. So the problem is getting worse year after year. And so basically what we heard from the chiefs when it comes to transfer is we're not interested in managing our own poverty. We're not interested in taking over a broken system. Once ISK, comes to terms with the fact that there is a massive backlog and, they make commitments to actually closing the backlog, then we'll take on the responsibility of managing housing programs and services. So that to me tells, just that alone tells me that we're probably looking at quite a few years before we'll see a pretty substantial move to transfer of care and control. With some exceptions, I think there are some communities that may be a little bit farther ahead, have stronger housing programs for one reason or another, and who might be wanting to move ahead. The other piece was ensuring that there's sufficient infrastructure. So it's not just closing the housing backlog, but it's also making sure there's enough space to build new homes. So fixing, a lot of these broken, federal tax regimes and land regimes. So like the ATR process, addition to reserve process, needs to be remedied so that First Nations have enough space to build. There's quite a few that just have no more land left and are encroaching on burial grounds and all kinds of other things to try and fit new homes in. And then the last piece is, like I said, in ensuring that there's sufficient infrastructure. So that sewage, water, all electrical, all that stuff is there. So that's basically the message we heard. Once those things are taken care of, First Nations will be willing to take over transfer. So you might have seen this slide in Grace's presentation as well. It's just the Ontario version, as I mentioned. We have an Ontario report that we can share with you all. So you can see there, housing is 25.8 billion, and then the entirety of the gap, including housing and infrastructure, 58.9 billion. Okay, so this goes a little bit deeper into what's actually in the models and how we sort of thought about, how this could operate, this transfer could operate in Ontario. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that today. Of course, like I said, I'm happy to share that report with you guys. I think I've only got about 10 more minutes left, and I've got another project to talk about. So in any case, this kind of goes into what these regional housing organizations would do. Basically, our model is based on there being a number of different regional housing organizations throughout Ontario. We estimate probably about 10, 15 of them. Some PTOs like Treaty 3 might want their own. Some tribal councils might want their own. Some large First Nations might want their own. So we're estimating, between 10 and 15 would probably be the number that end up sort of coming together. And we've kind of been basing our modeling off of that. And then really what these organizations do would really be up to the chiefs and technicians, from that area, what they would want from a housing organization. Is it going to be providing training? Is it going to be, setting housing standards? Is it going to be drafting housing policy? Like it would really be, how much the chiefs want this organization to do. And then we also accounted for a bit of collective action at the Ontario level. So if you've got 10, 15 organizations throughout Ontario, is there a benefit to them kind of coming together somehow to interact with, let's say, the provincial government or the federal government to do some collective bargaining? And what might that look like? How much would that cost? Would that be worthwhile? Would that be, politically possible? So we started to ask some of those questions. Again, all of that's in the report. And then we did some early costing. I'm going to skip over this for now just because we're actually, I think, probably going to review this somewhat. We're going to change some of the numbers in here. But this is what we have for now. And when I do take this on the road, as I said, and actually start, interfacing with chiefs and technicians, it will have some clearer numbers for people. So in terms of next steps, like I said, we're going to be finishing up this costing report. Trying to make it as best as we can, and then bring that to the Chiefs in Assembly for their final approval. So we're going to be delivering that this summer at the June Assembly. I believe we're in Rama this year. Okay, so that was one of the projects that we're working on. The second is an off-reserve housing data sovereignty project, and I've got about 7 minutes, so I'm going to go through this real quick. Again, we have a mandate from the Chiefs in Assembly to do this work. We try very hard at the Chiefs of Ontario not to overstep, not to do anything that the Chiefs don't tell us to do. That's really important to us. So we have all the resolutions required to do all this kind of stuff. The work to date, so it actually kind of lined up in a really interesting kind of way. We actually started on an off-reserve project that the chiefs told us, hey, look, we have some concerns about the way housing is working off reserve. Can you guys go take a look, essentially? What's going on out there? And we said, okay, and we went to CMHC, we got some funding, and we did an environmental scan, kind of looking at, who's delivering housing services off reserve. We did a literature review and looked at other regions. So, what's happening in BC, what's happening in Quebec. And then we did a feasibility study on, what it might look like for chiefs to start getting more involved in the off-reserve space. And again, this is a report that I can share with anyone who wants it. But based on those findings, we developed some recommendations to look at for the chiefs. Now, around the same time, it was announced, and it had been in the works for a while, but we had finally gotten the exact number. It was announced that we would be getting, or Ontario would be getting $142 million over 7 years for off-reserve housing. So this just came right after we had started finishing up our off-reserve housing project or our research project, and then it was announced that this is how much Ontario would be getting, and that it was First Nations specific. So this was not, funding that First Nations would have to compete for, and this was not going to Métis or Inuit or anybody else. So we were basically notified about this in August. We were told basically you have until December to come up with a way to spend the first 10 million, which is for this fiscal year, which is of course very difficult. So we put things into first gear, and we did some engagements. We spoke to technicians, we spoke to chiefs, and we developed a list of about 4 different options for the consideration of the chiefs. We didn't make it in time for our assembly, so we brought the decision to our leadership council, which is all the Grand Chiefs and the regional chief and a few other of the chiefs of the large First Nations. And their decision was to spend the first 10 million for this fiscal year on a data research project, so an off-reserve housing research project. So the idea here is to start working with municipalities, because I don't know if any of you know how housing and homelessness data gets collected off reserve. It's all done by municipalities, and none of it's OCAP protected. It's basically done very differently in different municipalities. Sometimes it's not done at all, so they're not asking. We don't have any First Nations data or Indigenous data in some municipalities, and so the purpose of this project is to work with the PTOs like Treaty 3 and Anishinaabeg and NAN to start collecting that data in a more systematized way, making sure that it's OCAP protected, and start developing data sharing agreements between those municipalities and First Nations. Also, there's some costs as well associated with data storage. So like I said, that was the decision made by the Leadership Council in December. And so we'll be executing that over the next 5 years. And in the meantime, as well, there's $132 million that still needs to be spent. So for next year's portion, I believe it's about 20 million. We'll be, working with the various organizations, First Nations, to put some options in front of the chiefs so that they can decide how to allocate that money. What we've been pushing is that this money go directly to building homes as much as possible, so that it's not going to a new layer of bureaucracy or anything like that. It's really helping people directly. So we're hoping that that's the route we take, but of course that's a decision for leadership to make. And so this goes a little bit more into what the project is. There's going to be a technical committee that'll help lead this project. So if you're affiliated with any of the political territorial organizations, we'll be reaching out to you guys soon to get some participation on this committee. and they'll help steer the next phases of the project. All right, thank you. That's all I got for today. Happy to answer any questions in the last 2 minutes that we've got here.